another day to make that progressive push. And it starts right here on the Wake Up Call.
All right, so we are talking about banking this morning. All right, so we started out talking about the charges, the fees, commercial banks versus credit unions, the move, how much of an impact it would make on the banking sector, commercial versus credit unions, and the importance of each and the fact that they can both coexist. All right, now at this time we're going to touch on derisking. Our guest this morning, Mr. Brian Glasgow, he's a chartered accountant, right, and former partner at KPMG. Right now, he's working privately. He is going to explain exactly what derisking is. And I know you would remember very recently when the news broke about CIBC and the consortium and the Bank of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And we're going to touch on the positives out of that. All right? Welcome back, Mr. Glasgow.
Thanks a lot, Ms. Oliver. And let's start talking about de-risking. But
right.
In order to discuss de-risking, I think we need to understand a concept that is known as correspondent banking. So I will start with that.
Okay.
Now, there are basically two types of commercial banks that operate in the Eastern Caribbean. These are international banks, and then there are indigenous banks. International banks would be the names that people would be familiar with, like Scotiabank, RBTT, CIBC.
Mm-hmm.
These are banks that operate in first world countries. They operate in the US, they operate in Canada. And indigenous banks are banks like our local banks here that operate mainly within the territory. Mm-hmm. Now, as we mentioned earlier, for example, that people need banks to make remittances, to send money in to St. Vincent from, say, the US or from the UK, or to send money from St. Vincent to pay for creditors, to pay for supplies, to pay Amazon, that sort of thing. So when a payment is made from, say, St. Vincent to somebody in the US, obviously the payment cannot go directly. If you're dealing with an international bank, it used to be a lot easier because the international bank, it's the same bank in the US as it is in St. Vincent. So they just use their network to facilitate the payment.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of the indigenous banks, if you were making a payment from an indigenous bank in St. Vincent, for example, to Bank of America in New York, there is no existing network. So you need what is called a correspondent bank to facilitate the transaction between St. Vincent and the bank in New York. You need a middleman. You need a bank that is going to take the money from St. Vincent
Mm-hmm.
and pay it to the bank in the US. So that is where correspondent banking originated. That is what it means.
Okay.
It basically means a bank that facilitates payments between indigenous banks and banks in US or wherever else. The challenge that the US especially, and I mentioned the US, had many years ago was that they found that within the US and definitely within the European Union as well, there was an increase in what is known as financial and money laundering crimes. In other words, people were using banks to pay for drugs, to launder the proceeds of tax evasion, for example, to pay for arms for terrorists. and so on. So within the American system, the Americans clamped down on those types of transactions by internal regulation. In other words, the American government said, these types of transactions, you need to look out for them. This is what you need to do. So what a lot of persons did, especially people who wanted to continue to make these kind of transactions, they started opening offshore banks in countries, including St. Vincent. And the offshore banks then had access to the correspondent banks, who would then continue to facilitate the same types of illegal transactions. So, for example, you could come to an offshore bank in St. Vincent and make a payment of $500,000 to somebody to send you some hard drugs or something like that. So the American government, again, started complaining to the correspondent banks who were facilitating these transactions. And they said, look, we need you to stop these transactions. We need you to stop facilitating proceeds of crime. And the initial reaction from the correspondent banks was, look, that really is not our business. We can't do anything about it. So the American government said, okay, if it's not your business, we will make it your business. And the way they did that, they started imposing punitive fines on correspondent banks that were known to be involved in facilitating illegal transfers of money. So, for example, if the U.S. government found out that there was a bank in St. Vincent that was transferring hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars through a correspondent bank in the U.S., what they did was that for every illegal transaction, we will impose a significant fine.
Okay.
So they started imposing fines on these correspondent banks. So what happened was then correspondent banks became nervous about doing business in countries like ours. Because imagine all you're doing is facilitating a transfer of a couple $1,000s for somebody, and then because it's paying for drugs, because it's paying for arms and ammunition, you could potentially end up with a fine of $1 million or more.
Wow.
So the correspondent, that is where the risk came from. So it became risky for correspondent banks to continue relationships with indigenous banks and offshore banks. So if you have risk, you avoid the risk. And the correspondent banks then said, we like doing business with you, but we cannot continue to take the risk of doing business with you. So we're gone. And that is essentially what is known as derisking. So the correspondent bank said, it's not worth it. We don't want to do business with you anymore, but we cannot afford these fines. We cannot take the risk. And they cut off practically all of the offshore banks and a number of indigenous banks. Even St. Vincent and the Grenadines was badly affected a few years ago, to the extent you might remember that all of the indigenous banks could not make any payments outside of St. Vincent. So that is what derisking is in banking. Now, derisking affected indigenous banks because the international banks had the advantage of their international networks. But indigenous banks were exposed. So as a result of that, the indigenous banks now had to basically lobby the U.S. government and the correspondent banks to continue to do business with them. And one of the conditions of continuing to do business is that the indigenous banks had to implement international standards in terms of knowing their customer and looking out for illegal transactions.
Right.
So that is why, as we speak, if you go down to the bank with $10,001 and you try to deposit it in your account, you will have to complete a source of funds declaration. You would have to say where that money came from, what you did for it, who gave it to you, and so on.
Yeah, very familiar. I'm very familiar with getting cussed for it plenty times too.
Right. But, it is important that people understand why this is happening.
Right.
It's not to find out their business, but it's to protect the bank, and it's to protect the banking industry. Because if the banks do not do that, they will not be able to continue to maintain correspondent banking relationships. And in our situation now, where all of the international banks are pulling out, we really need to support our indigenous banks, because the indigenous banks are going to be the backbone of our regional banking and international banking industry. So it's important that people understand the need to comply with money laundering legislation. They need to understand why, when they go to open an account, why they need to submit 2, sometimes 3 sources of ID. That is in order to make sure that St. Vincent and the Grenadines and other countries in the Eastern Caribbean, and in fact the wider Caribbean, are able to continue to live in the international space in terms of being able to do business. If that falls down, our economy is threatened. I mean, the economy cannot survive without people moving money in and out of the country.
That is true.
So that is why it is so critical. And to the credit, the indigenous banks have strengthened their regulation, they've strengthened their ability to discover transactions, but it is also important for people like ourselves, the customers, to comply with the regulations. When you're asked to submit a statement of a source of funds declaration, don't complain, because there is a very good reason why it's been done.
But
So
complaining
by doing
could
that,
signal
you're
something,
contributing.
though.
Pardon?
Complaining, doesn't it signal something?
Complaining, no, it could be just frustration, because
Okay.
you remember years ago, you could walk into a bank with anything and nobody would ask you any questions. You could open an account and in the morning and in the afternoon you would get a passbook. When you open an account now and the bank asks you for 3 pieces of ID, you know you can't come back in the afternoon or even in 2 days to get your account, because what the bank has to do with that ID is to run it through a system to find out if you are involved in any illegal activities. And it doesn't really matter who you are. Every person has to go through that process. The bank has to know you. And if you give the bank 3 pieces of ID and the bank discovers that the person who submitted the IDs was wanted in the UK for money laundering or for drugs or something like that, the bank is going to tell you, and justifiably tell you, sorry, we cannot open an account for you. So that is really the essence of derisking. It is because of the need to control international crime, control money laundering, control this terrorist financing, try to control tax evasion and other financial crimes. That is why the system has become so challenging for all of us, but there's no other way. that is the way it is, and that's the way it's going to be going forward.
Okay. As you mentioned that, right, there are quite a number of people, and you are so correct, that do not understand why the banks are asking for these things. So they will get frustrated and upset, for example, when they try to open an account and the bank would ask you, you said three. I am not sure where it would ask you for 3 pieces of ID. 2 pieces of ID, proof of address, proof of address. Sometimes they ask you for a job letter. And if you don't have these things, there are other things that you can do, but they really need to verify a lot of information and try to avoid money laundering and criminal financing, as you correctly mentioned. It even goes as a simple thing as reactivating an account, a dormant account, right? Not just to open a new account. Sometimes some people's accounts need updating, and you still have to provide all of that information. Sometimes what happens as well, if you go to change money,
Exactly.
sometimes you need to have an account in order to do that because the bank needs to know about you. All right. Other instances, you mentioned declaring source of funds. And one of the things is that it doesn't have to be that figure that you mentioned, the $10,000. It could be for any amount.
Right.
Right. So I have had experiences where people are upset and frustrated because they do not understand why the banks are doing what they are doing, because they have to. Can't they as well lose their license if they don't comply with the international regulations?
Easily. And that is also one of the dangers, one of the risks. Because if a local bank is not compliant with money laundering legislation, firstly, the legislation itself, and there is very strong anti-money laundering legislation at a local level, the legislation itself will make it impossible for that bank to continue to do business. In fact, the central bank will potentially, eventually, take away your license. So it can be frustrating sometimes. I mean, all of us go through the process. We want to open an account quickly in a bank, and 2 weeks later, you're still waiting on the bank to get back to you, even after you complete all your paperwork. And they keep asking you for every account you open, even though the information is already in the bank. They keep asking you for your address. Sometimes I tell them, well, it's the same address you sent my bank statement to last month, but you still have to submit fresh information.
I know, right?
It's a frustrating process.
I mean, it's right there on your system. I have not moved. I still get the letters, as you said. Hello, it's right there. Why you need new things from me? Yeah.
And the only reason they need it is because the money laundering legislation, the banking regulation says each time an account is open, don't guess where the person is living. Ask them, and ask them to prove it.
Wow.
So that is the reason.
Wow.
Don't assume that because I was living wherever for the last 5 years that I'm still there. Get me to prove where I am living now.
Wow.
So, it's frustrating, but I think once we understand why it is being done, we will appreciate that we are being part of a process that is going to help the economy. Because we are part of the process that will allow indigenous banks to function in the same way that international banks were functioning or have been functioning. And that is the only way that our economy will continue to grow.
Something I'd like to add here. You mentioned tax evasion, right? And what comes to mind is returning nationals. The U.S. is asking for persons who have accounts in the U.S. Once you have an account in the U.S., there are certain things that you have to do outside of the U.S. once you have an account there, especially if your corresponding bank is a U.S. bank. Like, you have to fill out certain forms and you have to give certain information. And I know that there are some returning nationals who are hesitant to do that. But you have to. You have to provide the information because it is part of the banking regulations.
Right, and that comes from the U.S. loses a lot of tax, even up to now, from its citizens avoiding tax by having accounts in other countries undetected to the authorities in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So what the U.S. has said is that you're an American citizen or a green card holder, you have to declare every cent you make.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're working in St. Vincent and you're getting paid in St. Vincent,
Mm-hmm.
declare what you make in St. Vincent.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You will pay tax on what you make in St. Vincent, and they'll give you credit for any local taxes you pay.
Mm-hmm.
But once you are a U.S. citizen, any money that you make anywhere in the world is subject to taxation.
Anywhere.
And the U.S. government have put, and you know how powerful the U.S. government and the authorities are. If local institutions do not comply with what the U.S. are asking them to do, they could be blacklisted.
Jeez. And that's not good.
And nobody wants to be blacklisted in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So that is again, as you said, returning nationals have this additional stress. Mm-hmm. The bank has an additional responsibility to find out certain information about you and to report it back to the U.S. Not just find out, but actually report on what you have submitted to them.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's rather interesting, though. I mean, if I were the banks, I would just close those accounts. If you're non-compliant, just bye. Goodbye.
Safest thing to do, because sometimes you think you're just trying a little stroke with the bank by not saying something. Mm-hmm. But by doing that, you could be compromising the ability of the bank to continue to do business.
As simple as that.
As simple as that.
Affecting the entire economy by not being compliant. Wow, that is rather interesting. Concerning CIBC, though, sorry, you were going to say...
You go ahead.
All right, concerning CIBC, the reason that they are leaving, right, and a consortium was formed, and the indigenous banks, now in the indigenous bank in St. Vincent's case is Bank of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, right? Now, concerning CIBC, the reason they are leaving, is it because of derisking, or is it because they are not making enough money?
I have not seen any public declaration of why CIBC is leaving. Mm-hmm. But the general feeling is that it is not economically viable for them to continue to do business. You know, as we have been discussing for the past few minutes, the cost of a bank existing now is a lot more than it was years ago. You know, the cost of regulation. 25 years ago, you didn't have any bank called anti-money laundering officer. You didn't have to spend half an hour with your U.S. returning nationals to find out where their bank accounts are or what their source of income is. There is a cost to that type of business. They have to report activity not only locally, regionally, but internationally. So expensive for a bank are significant. In the smaller economies of the Eastern Caribbean, there isn't enough activity for the commercial bank, for the international banks, to justify that type of investment. In other words, you know, a commercial bank would be operating here, maybe 100 staff, and it's about standards. But in the context of what these banks make, it's nothing. So that is really the reason why the banks are pulling out. Based on the type of investment that they have in the country, the returns are too in the investment in the bigger territories would and so on, where you have a higher level of economic activity. But certainly in the OECD, realistically, we do not have that high level of economic activity to justify international banks remaining.
Oh.
So it is up to the indigenous banks now to support the economy by raising their standards, by introducing higher qualities of products, the higher qualities of IT platforms to meet the needs of the consumer.
Mm-hmm.
So, that is really where the banking industry is going and will be going over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. How many more, apart from CIBC, a list of the other international banks in St. Vincent and the Grenadines?
There are no, after the CIBC transaction and the RBTT transaction are completed, that's it for international banks.
Sorry?
After CIBC and after RBTT, there will be no true international banks. The biggest bank in terms of, not in terms of deposits, but the biggest bank in terms of the ownership would be Republic Bank, that is owned by Trinidad.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
But, there are pros and cons, right? Because an international investor coming into St. Vincent is going to ask, what banks do you have here? And an investor is happy to know that, for example, he can deal with the same bank here that he's dealing with in US or in Europe. But it is also just as comforting for an international investor to know that our indigenous banks are quality institutions, well-run institutions, who can provide the same services that the bank he is accustomed to dealing with can deliver. So, that puts a lot of pressure on us as a country to support our indigenous banks.
Well, at this time, we don't have a choice because after these two transactions are completed, what is left is just indigenous banks.
Yeah, it will be an international bank in a regional banking environment. Fortunately, the consortium approach is useful because it helps to spread the ownership.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just a bank that is owned in St. Vincent by only Vincentians. The risk is spread throughout the entire ECCU, the currency union, so that it no longer becomes like one or two small government-owned banks, but it becomes a consortium of regionally owned banks, yes, with some element of government ownership, but with a significant portion of private ownership, people in the EC owning shares in their own banks.
Would that make banking more difficult?
My honest answer would be that in the short term, there will be teething problems where the indigenous banks and the consortiums come up to speed in upgrading their IT platforms and consolidating their correspondent banking relationships. To their credit, I think the banks have been working at that level of upgrade for some time. And I would like to believe that within a few months, we shouldn't see any difference in the quality of services that we are getting from the consortiums and the indigenous banks than we've been getting from the international banks. So that's why I always think of the recent merger activity, the acquisition activity, as something positive because it now gives us as a region an opportunity to invest and to dictate our own future. We are not at the mercy of international banks anymore. We are now charting our own destiny as a region. So, yes, there will be short-term challenges, but I prefer to look at the positives.
Would that
The
mean
the future will be better for us
okay?
with us controlling our own banking industry.
Okay. As you mentioned that, one of the complaints that we've had from international banks, because the home branch is not St. Vincent based, because everything goes according to system and figures, they don't really know Vincentians. Sorry about that. They don't know the customers. They only know according to what's on paper, but don't know them personally. Would that mean that it will make it easier for Vincentians to acquire loans from the indigenous banks? Well, overall.
Well, I understand your point, right? That without that cultural barrier, there is a better understanding of the customer. And, you yourself, you've been a banker, and you know how important that sort of connection is, that knowledge of your customer in being able to deliver results and to get loans and so on. So, I totally agree with you that, yes, because of the stronger cultural connections between the customers and the consortiums, the regional consortiums, that there should be an increase in the level of customer service and efficiency.
All right. Let's hope. Well, that was my final question, really and truly. I'm not sure if you want to leave anything else with us concerning banking, maybe some advice for the listeners. Somebody asked a question here, but I think that can 2 pieces of ID be your birth paper, your national ID card? No, it has to be a photo ID.
It has to be photo ID.
Photo ID. So your look at me going back into my banking days. So it has to be your national ID card, your passport, or a driver's license. And no, a farmer's ID can't really work. It has to, this was an argument we had quite a number of times. It has to be government issued, like official government issued.
Right,
so your
your
library card cannot work. Your farmer's ID card cannot work. Right? So those 3. Right. Only those.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. A bit technical sometimes, but yeah. So any final thoughts, any advice whatsoever to the listeners?
No, well, first, before I leave, I'd just like to thank you, Ms. Oliver, for, giving me the opportunity to talk a little about something that is so topical in what's happening now in the region and in St. Vincent. I think the ideas you raised, the questions that you brought up were spot on. It's what people need to talk about. What I would maybe like to suggest, I keep reiterating that the credit union movement is central to the economy. I regretted earlier that I don't know enough about the credit union movement to give a really focused answer to our approach on how the credit unions will be dealing with this issue. And, you might want to consider getting one of the leaders in the credit union movement to join your program at a later date.
Yes.
But I'd like to thank your listeners for putting up with me, and happy to come back at any future time. Good luck and have a great rest of the day.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Glasgow. Have a wonderful day.
It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much. There you have it. Quite a lot of information was shared there in those 2 segments. We started a couple minutes onto the 8 o'clock hour, about 25 minutes onto 8. So if you missed part of the interview, you can get it back on Facebook at Extreme 104 SVG. But some rather important pointers came out in that. And I hope that, I know when I first heard about the the acquisition of CIBC, I was not happy as a customer. Not happy as a customer. Based on the services that are offered. And I know other customers were not happy about that. And at the time, I really couldn't see anything good coming out of it. And I'm happy that Mr. Glasgow was able to highlight some of the positives that are coming out of that acquisition there. Now, he mentioned, right? Now, bearing in mind, don't want to divulge too much of my personal information, but every bank in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, very unique. And there are people who are customers of different banks for different reasons, right? So you might be a customer of a credit union for one reason. You might be a customer of a different credit union for another reason. You might be a customer of the Indigenous Bank, Bankers in Vincent and Grenadines, for one reason, and might be a customer of one of the last two international banks, CIBC, for another reason. And then you might hop over to RBTD for a separate reason. And you see where I'm going with this, right? Everybody has a different attachment to a bank. Everybody is at a particular bank for a reason, right? Now, he mentioned that what needs to happen now, and he's confident going forward, that the Indigenous Bank that is set to acquire, once this transaction is final, would have to move towards getting to the level, basically, that CIBC is at. And for that Indigenous Bank, it presents an opportunity. It is not going to happen overnight. We are going to have to wait. And I would suspect and expect that there might be a bit of teething. I know they have started already, and there might be a little bit more teething as we improve on the banking system and the banking sector in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Now, what I was not too pleased about hearing, once the transactions that are on the books for RBTT and CIBC, once that is done, no more international banks in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. No more. That is it. SVG, according to Mr. Glasgow, who is a chartered accountant, right? So he knows about money. He knows about the sector. He knows about derisking. And I was very pleased with how he explained derisking. Instead of giving a definition of derisking, he went to the core and explained the risks that are associated with commercial banks, international banks, operating in regions or countries like St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But once these two transactions are complete, that is it. SVG's economy is just too small to support even two international banks. Just too small. And if you remember, when the news broke about the consortium and CIBC leaving or being on the books to leave St. Vincent, they're not leaving the entire region. They're staying in St. Lucia. They're remaining in Barbados. We're just too small. They're not making enough money. And then added to that, derisking. It's a challenge to get information from customers. We are in a region where we have to hone in on our anti-money laundering and anti-criminal financing. Quite an interesting discussion this morning. And I hope that you were listening attentively. I know when we have these sort of discussions, there's a lot to take in. And people are listening for the most part, and they don't really contribute. And that's fine. I understand what's happening. But let me read some responses coming from both Facebook and WhatsApp, right? Good morning, Crystal. Very interesting and enlightening topic. High five to you. Thank you. Well said. Very good information. All right? Coming from Facebook, not enough cash flow generating for those banks. Credit unions are beating them. Somebody says, I went through that 4 months ago in SVG, having to provide 1 million documents just to reactivate an account. Not sure how. Well, I think the ATMs, how are ATMs being used to launder money? Is it that you're wondering, or you want him to answer? You wanted him to answer. I'm sorry I didn't see this before he left, all right? But the ATMs are just a service, really. And it's not necessarily... Okay, let me not answer that. Good morning, Kareen. Good morning, Kareen. Morning. Radio refreshing. Thanks, Miss Oliver. Not a problem, all right? We're going to end the live right now. Wow, it's been 40 minutes.